Breaking news. Bill Cosby, yes, America's dad turned America's nightmare, is in handcuffs. Let that sink in. The man who used to tell families to eat pudding pops is now being escorted into a federal courthouse like the villain of a true crime documentary. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. This isn't just about decades-old scandals, lawsuits, or whispered rumors we all pretended we didn't hear. No. This time, the story is darker, louder, and way more personal. Because the name Malcolm-Jamal Warner just exploded back into the headlines. And trust me, you're not ready for what's about to unfold. Imagine this, a grieving mother standing in front of cameras, holding a USB drive like it's the smoking gun in a spy thriller, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking, as she whispers the words that shake the entire entertainment industry. He didn't drown, he was drowned. Boom, mic drop, cue chaos. The internet loses its collective mind, news outlets scramble to rewrite history, and suddenly, Bill Cosby is the face of something way bigger than anyone could have imagined. So ask yourself, was Malcolm's death really an accident? Or was it a cover-up wrapped in Hollywood smiles and NDAs thicker than your grandma's Sunday lasagna? Stay tuned, because this rabbit hole only goes deeper. Bill Cosby once paraded as the nation's father figure. The sweater-wearing icon who told jokes about family life and sold pudding pops like they were symbols of innocence. But now his image has collapsed into a nightmare that keeps twisting darker every day. And at the center of this storm is not just Cosby himself, but the man who grew up under his shadow, Malcolm-Jamal Warner, whose death was quietly written off as an accident. A vacation gone wrong, a drowning no one was supposed to question. Until his mother, Pamela Warner, decided to turn grief into a weapon and expose what she discovered in a secret USB drive that her son had hidden before his death. A drive filled with documents, recordings, and videos that ripped apart the curtain of Hollywood's most carefully guarded lies. The official story was neat and polished. Too neat, too polished. A simple report of a man taking an evening walk on a Costa Rican beach. Losing his footing, swept away by the tide. No foul play, no witnesses. Just a tragedy. The kind of tragedy the media packages into a brief headline and quickly forgets. But mothers do not forget. And Pamela Warner could not forget the unease in her son's voice in his last phone call. The cryptic words he left behind telling her that if something happened to him, she must tell the world he was not lying. And so when she found that USB sealed in the lining of his old winter coat, labeled only with the words "in case something happens to me," her trembling hands unlocked a vault of secrets no grieving parent should ever have to face. Inside the digital folder was a labyrinth of corruption, memos marked confidential, phone call recordings that should never have existed, wire transfers that connected powerful names to hidden accounts, NDAs that read like gag orders for survivors, and buried deep within was a folder called Shadow Network, and in every file, every transcript, one name surfaced again and again, Bill Cosby, circled, highlighted, repeated, like the centerpiece of a puzzle no one was supposed to solve. Pamela watched the videos her son recorded, his tired face staring into the camera, whispering that if she was seeing the message, it meant he had been silenced, warning her that there was a machine designed to erase anyone who tried to speak the truth, not just silence them, but rewrite their stories, drown them in rumors, and if necessary, make their deaths look like misfortune. His words were raw, trembling but resolute, and as Pamela fell to her knees with the weight of realization, she knew this was no accident. Her son had been erased, and now she carried the proof. She took it to the Department of Justice, hoping for action, but weeks passed without a sound. As if the evidence had vanished into the same silence that had swallowed her son. Until one night she received a message from an unknown number telling her to check the news, and there it was flashing across every major network. Federal investigation opened into Malcolm-Jamal Warner's death, with Bill Cosby named as a central figure. And within 72 hours, cameras captured Cosby being led into custody, his face expressionless. The illusion of America's dad finally shattered beyond repair. But the arrest was only the beginning, because once Pamela's evidence surfaced, others began to come forward. Former assistants who admitted they were paid to destroy documents. Editors who confessed they were ordered to bury Malcolm's footage. Even a late-night producer who revealed he was told to cut segments where Warner hinted at something bigger. And suddenly Pamela's voice was no longer just a grieving mother's cry. It was the rallying call of a movement. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Crowds outside the courthouse holding candles and posters. Murals appearing overnight with Warner's face beside the words "He did not drown, he was drowned." Social media flooded with voices that had once been too afraid to speak, and the silence that had protected predators for decades began to crumble. News anchors whispered about files they could not air. Lawyers dodged questions they could no longer dismiss. Executives scrambled to distance themselves from a man they once celebrated. And all the while, Pamela Warner stood quietly, holding her son's letter in her hands, the one he had written in case the worst happened. The letter that said he trusted her to keep the truth alive. And that was the point when the story crossed from scandal to reckoning. Because this was not just about one man's crimes. This was about a machine built on silence, powered by fear and money. A machine Malcolm had traced and documented and was ready to expose before someone got to him first, and as his mother breathed life into his evidence, the machine finally began to shudder under its own weight as the walls of silence began to crack. The world suddenly realized how deep this rot went. Because what Pamela had revealed was not just a personal tragedy, but a blueprint for how Hollywood had buried truth for decades. And when the Department of Justice unsealed the first wave of files from what was now being called the Warner Archive, the revelations were so shocking that even hardened reporters struggled to keep a steady voice. On air, the documents showed not only discussions about silencing Warner but chillingly detailed crisis containment strategies written like instruction manuals for corporate homicide. With one memo dated just 2 days before Malcolm's death instructing executives that if containment fails, redirect through tragedy, and adding in cold sterile language that the ocean remains a viable optic, which was not metaphor but an explicit plan to disguise murder as misfortune. And alongside this were recordings of phone calls between network officials debating how to stop Warner from speaking publicly. One voice warning he is not a kid anymore, he is tracking patterns, and another coldly replying then let us make sure he does not. A back and forth that felt less like corporate chatter and more like a conspiracy ripped out of a dystopian novel, yet it was not fiction, it was real. And the proof was spilling into the public domain faster than the machine could cover it. And Pamela, who had carried grief like a chain for years, now found herself transformed into the face of a movement that no one could contain. Outside courtrooms, thousands gathered, carrying candles and photos. While artists painted Warner's likeness across walls from Los Angeles to New York with words reminding everyone that he did not just die but was erased. And the protests swelled, with a mix of anger and sorrow. A demand not just for justice against one man but for dismantling the system that enabled him. The so-called silence machine that Malcolm himself had named in his notes. And then came the testimonies, one after another. Insiders who had stayed silent for decades now stepping forward. Their voices shaking but undeniable. A studio assistant admitting he was told to shred entire boxes of Warner's research. A legal aide confessing she drafted fake settlement offers to survivors. A retired producer recalling late-night phone calls where the directive was simple. Do not let Malcolm speak. All of it adding up to a picture that no spin doctor could blur. The turning point arrived when a former bodyguard of Cosby's took the stand. A man who had worked closely with him for years, his voice low, his hands trembling, confessing that he had been assigned to track Warner not to protect him but to monitor his movements, and that on the day Warner died, he received a single call with the words, "Stand down, it is handled." And the courtroom gasped, as if oxygen had been sucked out of the room, the judge visibly shaken, because in that moment the narrative of accident collapsed entirely, replaced by the undeniable shadow of orchestration. Cosby himself sat stone-faced, silent, refusing to react, but his silence spoke volumes. And the machine he had once relied on to shield him seemed to crumble piece by piece, as the testimony stacked higher than any defense his lawyers could mount. Meanwhile, beyond the court, the leaks continued, because Pamela had not released everything at once. She had held back, knowing there was more. And when a second drive emerged anonymously from within one of the networks, labeled simply buried, the contents exploded like dynamite under an already trembling industry. Because these were not just notes and memos, these were risk assessments, internal reviews from PR firms detailing worst-case scenarios. One document bluntly stating, if Warner publishes activate mitigation protocol, monitor movements, contingency in place. Contingency being the sanitized, corporate term that everyone now understood as code for elimination. Pamela read those words, holding her son's sweatshirt, whispering through tears that they had planned everything. And this time the public believed her, because the evidence was overwhelming. And because Malcolm's own voice haunted every corner of the leaks, his recordings filled with fear but also defiance, whispering that he was tired but unafraid, that he refused to stay quiet even if it cost him everything. And while Cosby's legal team tried to dismiss the files as doctored, blaming hackers or smear campaigns, the sheer volume of corroborating evidence made their defense sound hollow, like a desperate attempt to shout over a storm that was already raging. And the storm only grew louder as senators began calling for congressional review, networks announced internal investigations, and federal prosecutors confirmed that Cosby's arrest was only the beginning of a much wider probe into the shadow network. Pamela never sought fame, never wanted to be on every news channel, but her voice had become impossible to ignore. And when she finally stood before cameras clutching Malcolm's photo, and said they tried to silence him but all they did was give him a louder voice, it was no longer just a mother's grief. It was a revolution. And the machine that had operated in silence for decades was finally being dragged into the light. Unable to hide, unable to deny, and unable to erase the truth any longer. But if anyone thought the storm had reached its peak, they were mistaken because the deeper investigators dug into the Warner archive. The more grotesque the reality became, and soon it was not just about Cosby as a single fallen figure but about a sprawling web of executives, politicians, media moguls, and shadow financiers who had thrived for decades behind the illusion of family-friendly entertainment and philanthropic smiles while operating a machinery of intimidation and control that had kept survivors silent and whistleblowers buried in obscurity or worse, and what made it even more chilling was how methodical it all was, as if silence itself had been industrialized, packaged and sold like a product, and Malcolm had simply stumbled too close to the factory floor. The files revealed detailed records of payments routed through offshore accounts with amounts that stretched into the millions, money that was disguised as charitable donations or production budgets, but in reality served as hush money for victims or bribes for insiders to look away. In one especially damning ledger listed the names of those who had received what was euphemistically labeled as silent stipends, and among the names were not just unknown staffers but recognizable figures from television, film, and even politics, names that made anchors pause mid-sentence when reading them on air. Because suddenly the conspiracy was not confined to one disgraced comedian but seeped into the very foundations of the industries that claimed to entertain and inform the public. Each day new fragments of evidence came out, and each day the crowds outside the courthouse swelled into seas of fury. With chants that shook the city echoing through the night, they killed Malcolm, they killed the truth, they killed the voice, and in those chants, Pamela Warner stood silently, often clutching her son's photos, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply weeping, but always present, always unyielding, and her presence seemed to give courage to others who had been afraid for years, because soon anonymous testimonies began to pour in through encrypted channels. Survivors who had been silenced by NDAs that threatened them with ruin if they spoke now felt empowered by the tidal wave of public outrage, and they began sending in their own pieces of the puzzle, and the picture that emerged was darker than even Pamela had imagined. There were reports of secret retreats where executives met to design narratives, reports of manipulated news cycles where scandals were deliberately buried under trivial distractions, reports of coerced settlements that were never filed with courts but handled in quiet luxury suites with lawyers signing checks as if they were ordering dinner, and every piece matched something in Malcolm's files, confirming that he had not been chasing shadows but had been on the brink of exposing a reality too dangerous to be allowed to reach the light. The legal system struggled to keep pace. With the sheer avalanche of evidence, judges worked overtime, prosecutors raced to assemble indictments, and defense teams threw out desperate theories, blaming hackers, foreign agents, even artificial intelligence for fabricating the documents. But every time a theory collapsed, another file emerged, another witness spoke, another recording surfaced, until the defense looked less like a team of lawyers and more like actors, reading bad scripts to an audience that no longer believed. Cosby himself remained silent throughout the proceedings, his once booming voice reduced to occasional whispers to his attorneys, his face blank as though carved in stone. And yet that silence no longer carried power, it carried guilt, it carried the weight of a man who knew the tide had turned irreversibly against him. And every time the court played one of Malcolm's recordings, the room felt electrified, because his voice echoed not as a ghost, but as a warrior who had managed to transcend death itself, leaving behind proof so irrefutable that it dismantled the machine he had fought against. The turning point came when an independent financial auditor released a report showing direct wire transfers from a shell company linked to Cosby into an account in the Cayman Islands only 48 hours before Warner's death, and the memo line on the transfer coldly read "contingency activation," a phrase already identified in multiple documents as the final step when silencing by other means failed, and when that report hit the news, even those who had tried to defend Cosby began backing away. Studios erased his image from archives, networks canceled syndication deals, charities removed his name from their boards, and statues once erected in his honor were torn down by protesters in broad daylight. Pamela watched it all unfold with a mixture of sorrow and vindication, often saying, "This is not justice yet, this is only the beginning," because for her the fight was never only about punishing one man, it was about tearing down the system that took her son from her. And as more and more insiders came forward with additional evidence, the government announced what many had been demanding, a full-scale commission of inquiry into the entertainment industry's silence machine with subpoena powers and cross-jurisdictional authority, something unprecedented in modern times. The announcement alone shook boardrooms across the country, stocks of major networks plummeted overnight, shareholders demanded resignations, executives scrambled for damage control, but the momentum was unstoppable, and for the first time in decades, the machine looked vulnerable, fragile, even on the verge of collapse. And in the streets, the people who had once been passive consumers of media turned into active voices demanding accountability, refusing to be distracted by the usual circus of celebrity scandals because they had seen behind the curtain, and could not unsee the rot that lay beneath. And in the midst of all this, Pamela Warner continued to speak, not with theatrics or scripted lines, but with the raw honesty of a mother who had lost everything and yet found purpose in carrying forward her son's truth, reminding the world that he had been silenced, but his voice was louder than ever because it was now amplified by millions. When the verdict finally came after months of hearings, mountains of evidence, and oceans of tears, it was delivered in a courtroom so crowded that people stood pressed against walls, straining to hear the words "guilty" on all counts, and for a brief moment, silence filled the room, not the manufactured silence of intimidation, but the stunned silence of justice being acknowledged. And then the roar erupted from outside, crowds chanting Malcolm's name, bells ringing, reporters shouting, but through it all, Pamela simply closed her eyes, whispered, "I kept my promise," and held her son's photo to her chest, knowing the battle was far from over, but the truth had finally broken through the walls built to contain it, and the world would never look at the smiling facade of Hollywood the same way again. So now you have heard it all, the truth, the lies, the cover-ups, the tears, the silence, the files, the money trails, and the verdict. But the question is, what will you do with this truth? Will you just sit back, shake your head, and scroll to the next video, pretending it is just another Hollywood scandal, or will you recognize that this is a mirror being held up to every one of us, showing how easily we can be distracted, how quickly we can be silenced, how powerfully the system can bury the inconvenient and glorify the guilty? Because Malcolm's story is not just about one man or one family, it is about every voice that has ever been pushed into the shadows. It is about every truth that has ever been bought, gagged, and buried. And if his mother could stand in the streets every single day with nothing but a photo in her hand and still bring the walls crashing down, then what excuse do we have not to demand more, not to question harder, not to keep shouting until the silence machine breaks completely? So like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, share it with everyone, and subscribe because the fight is just beginning.